fantasy-animation.org is a website with a difference. It is not for profit, and it's run entirely by academics and professional animators, and this means that whether you are reading our latest blog or accessing our latest podcast, thanks for downloading by the way, you can be sure that you are getting the most up-to-date and informed commentary on the colliding worlds of fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Whether you are a budding animator yourself, a student of fantasy or animation, or just someone who wants to learn more about the history and theory behind these overlapping media, mediums and genres, why not find out more at fantasy-animation.org or subscribe to our various social media threads on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Reddit, at fananimresearch, FANANIM research. While you're at it, subscribe to the podcast, give us a star rating, and better yet, a quick written review as well. It all helps to make the visibility of our project even stronger and attract more like-minded people like yourself to our growing network of fans. For now, do enjoy the show.
Welcome, folks, to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, a slightly croaky Chris Holliday.
And me, a perfectly eloquent Alex Sargent.
Now, this is, and I don't say this lightly, a monumental episode for three reasons of the podcast. The first is that this is our very first to feature our new theme tune, which you've just heard, composed by music student Francesca Naranjo Araujo, who studies music here at King's College London. And we're really grateful to Francesca for putting this together and sort of doing, I think when we spoke to her, we wanted something sort of, the things that we do intellectually, we wanted the podcast to do sonically, and I think she's really captured the relationship between fantasy and animation.
Yeah, Francesca worked with us basically over the summer of this year, going back and forth, hearing our barely articulate ideas about music and translating them into something meaningful, and coming up with what we think is a really great theme tune for the show. So we're really proud of it. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and you're going to be hearing it on all future episodes to come. So future listeners, this was the episode where it first started. There you go.
Yeah. So Francesca's kindly put together an introduction or an introductory music piece, and then something that will serve as an outro for podcast episodes. And Francesca, we've asked her to reflect a little bit on her process and how she kind of came to what fantasy animation sounds like. And there'll be a future blog post coming up, so do keep your eyes peeled for that.
Yeah, you'll be able to find it at fantasy-animation.org, as long with all our other blog posts. We'll put a link to it somewhere obvious on the website as well. So do check out Francesca and give her a Google, see what else she's doing, and check out the rest of her work, because she's obviously very talented.
Yeah.
We're very lucky to have her write our theme tune.
Yes.
So that's reason number one, Chris. What's reason number two?
Second reason why this is a special episode, if you like, a monumental episode, is that this episode is the outcome of our recent social media poll, where we asked you to vote for your favourite Don Bluth film. You will have seen videos of Alex bringing out the infamous hat out of retirement. Obviously, we did an earlier instalment where we looked at Land Before Time. You literally voted in your ones, with the result nothing short of a landslide for this, The Secret of NIMH, Bluth's first feature as a director from 1982.
A surprise result,
yeah.
I must admit. I was convinced we were going to be talking about either Anastasia or American Tail today, but Secret of NIMH is a film I really like. I think it really sets the sort of stage for Bluth's contribution to animation history really well. It's a great film to talk about, and I'm excited to talk about it with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots, I think, in terms of anthropomorphism that we could reflect on. I think, the way that the character, and also something around character design that sort of helps to place Bluth. I've written in my notes somewhere between Disney and Bakshi, and I think this film's doing some interesting stuff with fantasy. But the third reason why this is a monumental episode is that it's the film that has me and Alex back together in the same room as we record for the first time face to face in about 18, 19 months or so. So no guests this time, just the two of us. So if we weren't as excited enough to talk about early Don Bluth, I'm now literally sitting close enough to Alex to touch him. So there you go.
I mean, that's an odd way of phrasing it.
We're
right here. We're in the room where it happens.
We are.
It's great to be back after all that time on Zoom. Zoom. We will probably Zoom now and again in future
yeah.
because it's been really great to connect with guests around the globe in the way we wouldn't, and to involve listeners a bit more, and we'll continue doing some of that. But it is nice to be back in a room recording, seeing you across. Look at that lovely face. There it is. Oh no, I get to see it, everybody, but there it is.
Yeah. Video podcasts coming soon. So this film, Secret of NIMH, cards on the table. I'm familiar with the film, but I've never seen it. But I feel like, Alex, you've encountered this film through your sort of research into fantasy. So where and how has this contact with the film happened?
So I think I'm more of a Bluth nostalgia fan than perhaps you are. I watched a lot of Bluth films when I was a kid, but this wasn't one of them. I was American Tail, Anastasia, Land Before Time was the big one. We've already covered that on a previous episode. But I did encounter Secret of NIMH when I started doing very early research for what eventually became my book, Encountering the Impossible: The Fantastic in Hollywood Fantasy Cinema.
That was gratuitous.
Available bookshops. So yes, and I was struck when I watched it by some of the stuff you mentioned in your intro there, just about sort of the way in which it very clearly announces a departure point for Bluth. Bluth is often seen, when I read him in animation history, almost as the guy that kicked Disney up the bum and made Disney be more Disney. But actually, I don't see it that way. I think what Bluth does is he creates an innovative and creative environment for animation. He may kickstart a vitality in the studio and a sense of competition. But Bluth's style, his way of making films, I think is very different to the Disney that came before it, and would be very influential on the Disney that would come. But this is a movie that has all kinds of differences to what we might call a typical Disney movie, and it is very much a flag in the sand. I am Don Bluth and I am making animation this way. And we could talk about the ways it plays with rhetorics of fantasy, the book that it adapts and the complexities of what that book's trying to do and the movement it fits within. But I think it's very much it's a Don Bluth movie, and it sets the stage for what Don Bluth movies are going to look like over the next couple of decades. So I think in that way it's really interesting.
Yeah, no. I have a few notes around animated mice and rats and rodents and things. But actually, I had a... Dare I do? Now we're back in the room. Dare I do my own impossible question?
Sure.
It actually comes off of something you just said in relation to the 1980s. So this film is 1982, and I think a lot was happening in the 1980s, specifically at Disney. And I know that you've written about Disney's kind of quote unquote dark ages. Mm-hmm. So my impossible question really was Bluth is making The Secret of NIMH as an adaptation from a 1971 children's novel, and he's making this as a conscious departure, or supposedly a departure from Disney, and announcing himself. Is this film, or did Disney's Dark Ages of the 1980s then respond to this sort of film? Did it respond to Bluth in terms of what he was doing in the 1980s? Then you have, this is only 3 years before the Black Cauldron, which I know that you've written about. So let's do a bit of context here.
Sure.
Disney's Dark Ages and Bluth.
Yeah, well, yes is the easy answer to the impossible question. I can't help but see a trajectory from the kind of stuff Disney are making in the mid 70s. So Robin Hood, even things like right back to the 60s, like 101 Dalmatians, Jungle Book, that kind of what we might call low fantasy effort. Not in terms of quality necessarily, although that tends to be how they're read. And then we jump to the so-called Disney Renaissance of Little Mermaid, Aladdin, these kind of films that, yes, in one way kind of look backwards towards Disney's lore, but in many ways are very sophisticated efforts of world building. If you think about Little Mermaid, one of the massive embellishments of Little Mermaid is the underwater sort of universe that Clements and Musker kind of create and embellish within their screenplay. And even things like Aladdin, the world of Agrabah, even the world of Pride Rock. And I think Bluth's legacy to animation history should be that he is one of the most sophisticated builders of worlds in popular animation that I think we've ever had. I think all of his films are so rich not necessarily actually in their storytelling necessarily, but in the feeling of a world created on screen that Disney are just not doing before this era. So I absolutely think there is a clear influence on this, as well as things like Bakshi and Wizards, which we've done a podcast on before, in the richness they bring to the fantasy worlds they build, their desire to build fantasy worlds on screen, and how that then reflects in later studio efforts. Yes, things like the Black Cauldron, which was commercially unsuccessful, but even things that become commercially successful that we know as sort of being classic Disney movies, actually they're very much indebted to this kind of style of filmmaking.
Well, what struck me about this film is that it is very much, if we place this film 1982, the year before Disney had made The Fox and the Hound, and it would be 3 years later that they'd make The Black Cauldron. 1986 would be The Great Mouse Detective, which I think is very much in conversation with this film, especially the design of the villainous character, so Ratigan in The Great Mouse Detective, and then I can't remember the name of the villainous one.
Jenna in this,
okay.
yes. Jenna, the villainous rat.
Not to be confused with Jeremy, who is an altogether different...
Oh, we've got plenty to say about him.
So... And even 1977, The Rescue. So you have The Rescue as The Fox and the Hound, The Black Cauldron, The Great Mouse Detective, Oliver and Company, and then Little Mermaid. Sure. So clearly, and that's when we talk. Is that right? When we talk of the Dark Ages, we're really talking about that sort of 80s ambivalent relationship that Disney has to fantasy films.
Well, yes. I would argue that in the same way that the Dark Ages were never actually that dark, we've created this concept of the Disney Dark Ages because we are obsessed with kind of so-called classic Disney, the sort of Disney of the late 30s and the 40s. Into the 50s. Disney didn't really last very long. It's about like 6 movies, but those movies that we all know, and this new batch of movies, late 80s, early 90s, and therefore to valorize those two periods, we create this sort of the second act where things go badly, and certainly commercially things perhaps go badly. But I've always liked a lot of those so-called Disney Dark Ages movies. But the way I'd like to think about it is that if they feel a little bit less like those other periods, it's because they're drawing on what's popular, and what's popular during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s is fantasy and sci-fi, and that kind of it's the emergence of what are now the popular genres of today, but Hollywood doesn't quite know how to do them properly. So these animations are as much speaking to the films that are live action surrounding them, things like the sort of the late 70s, early 80s high fantasy craze, as much as they are back to animation history. So there's a really important bridging story here, which is that it's not that Disney have just suddenly decided not to make good movies. It's that they're trying new references and new styles. Yeah. And Bluth is the one that goes, we can bring animation storytelling, anthropomorphism, all those things that we've kind of sold and cutesified and made commercial successes in dialogue with rich fantasy rhetoric, immersive stories, complicated stories, quest narratives. We can bring the two of those things together and we can create something like The Secret of NIMH that on the one hand is Lord of the Rings, and on the other hand is Basil the Great Mouse Detective, isn't it?
That speaks to what, let's say, the secret. What the Secret of NIMH is doing is, I would argue, anticipating certain. I mean, as I said, the Great Mouse Detective was definitely something that connected up to what I was thinking about in terms of how this film treats, as you say, that anthropomorphic register. And in many ways, this is probably going to be the episode where we do anthropomorphism in detail. We've talked about it and mentioned it in lots and lots of different ways and in lots and lots of different contexts. But this film was really striking for me because it talks about magic, but it also talks about electricity. It talks about humanity, but it also talks about sort of nature and industrialization. And there's one line that really gets it for me. So the villainous rat says, "No taste for blood, they've taken the animal out of you." This is a really reflexive film about, not animation, we've done that before, but about anthropomorphism, about what it means to make non-humans human-like, and the fluctuations between the poles of nature and culture. And Bluth seems to be somebody, and I think he is caught between a sort of industrial and aesthetic logic of Disney with a whiff of Bakshi, and there's something really striking about Bluth's intermediary position and his reconciliation of old and new, which I find really intriguing in this film.
Right. Well, should we try and set up the sort of the story of the film then, or both the story in the film but also the story of the film? So this is Bluth's first feature animation since departing the Disney studio. If people don't know, Don Bluth was a pretty high-ranking animator in the Disney studio in the late 70s, got frustrated with the way the studio was going, left and founded his own company and took quite a lot of the animators with him, set up these Don Bluth Productions. And this is the first effort from that, and he had chose to adapt a fantasy novel, a children's fantasy novel from the early 1970s, which I believe someone pitched at Disney. I don't quite know the full story of this. I believe someone, whether it was him or not, pitched as a possible Disney feature, and no one kind of wanted it, so he took it and got the rights himself. And the novel was called Mrs. Frisby.
Yep.
I say Frisbee because we're going to come to that in just a second. Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, which is an odd little novel by Robert O'Brien. An odd little novel in that it's a book that kind of taps into quite a short-lived but very interesting kind of mode of fantasy, which we might call kind of, for want of a better term, anthropomorphic high fantasy. In that, on the one hand, it's a story about farms and mice and rats and voles and crows, and the world of the film is very much set in this world. It's in the farmer's field with mice who talk. So there's a certain Watership Down, Animals of Farthing Wood element to it. But it's also a story about the Grand Owl and magic and wizards, and so it's very much playing in that world as well. So anthropomorphic high fantasy, in that the fantasy belongs to the world of the animals. There is magic in that world, but at the same time, the film is constantly, and the book is constantly, setting that in contrast with the world of humans and the world of real scale and all this kind of stuff. And it therefore has hallmarks of things like Brian Jacks' Redwall series and other books to come that kind of play in this. On one hand, you could simply make all the characters, and I think you said this while we were watching the film, you could make all the characters, there's Gandalf, there's the adventurer, there's the plucky, there's the Shire, there's all this stuff. But also, this is all set in a farmer's field. So that on the one hand, it's Lord of the Rings, but on the other hand, it's Watership Down. And that's kind of what the playbook that Bluth is then using to make this film out of. That's the setup of the book. We'll do the plot itself, but do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I suppose the going back to your point about scale, I was interested in this sort of rodent cinema and animation. This is Ratatouille, biker mice from Mars, Tube Mice, which is about some mice that live on the tube, the underground. Obviously, American Tail, and then Basil the Great Mouse Detective, to name one of many. And why animation is continually drawn, and actually to that sort of type of character, and obviously Mickey Mouse, but why, and if Bluth is therefore trying to do something different with a well-worn anthropomorphic register up to this point. And of course, I think the film plays on, even going back to something when we did Mr. Bug Goes to Town, that sort of the jeopardy of scale, but also the way in which anthropomorphic characters either live in a world of their own size and making, or they live in a world which is of human scale. And that's what a lot of more recent computer animated films are interested in. This film is caught between those two ways of thinking about anthropomorphic characterization. It's doing both the Disney, everything shrunk down to the animal size, and it's doing the jeopardy of a world that's bigger than them.
As much as we're talking about a film set in a farmyard, there's a scale and ambition to the storytelling going on here that is really quite, if you think about it, I mean, the film begins with, we get introduced to the main character, Mrs. Brisby, and according to the internet, which is always a reliable source.
Tell me about the internet, Alex.
So this is probably hypocritical and nonsense, but I like it to be true. They changed the name from Frisbee to Brisby at the last minute because Frisbee, the toy manufacturer, kind of got wind of this, and they didn't want to have a Frisbee associated with this movie. So I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think I would watch this movie if the character was called Frisbee and think small plastic discs that you can,
Yes.
But fair enough. So Mrs. Brisby, who is a widow. I think is a widow. Is a she is that her husband has died sometime before the start of the movie. We never really find out exactly how long ago, but I think she has 3 young children. So within her recent past, her husband Jonathan Frisbee, who he keeps getting referred to, she's often referred to as Mrs. Jonathan
Brisby.
There
you go. So we've all got it wrong.
Mrs. Jonathan Grisby.
Brisby.
She's often referred to as, everyone who meets her knows about her husband.
Because she wouldn't be a female character if she wasn't defined through her husband. Well, carry on.
Yeah, but yes. Okay, so there's that. I think the issue of her being a widow is really interesting because, yes, there is that, in that she is constantly referred. Do we even learn her first name in the movie?
No, because when she first meets some of the other characters are all referred, the men, Jeremy, Justin, Jenna, I suppose, or the Great Owl. And she refers to herself, so she's voiced by Elizabeth Hartman, always refers to herself as, I'm Mrs. Brisby. So
Brisby.
Mrs. Brisby, yes.
Yes, so there is that issue in that she's often defined in relation to her husband. Her husband, we found out, is this hero from the past. He's done some things we'll get to as we keep going through the plot.
Yeah.
I think that's a problem. I don't think that's great. I do think having the main character as a widow is an interesting one, in that, one, we have a female protagonist leading this entire story. She's very much the kind of causal agent throughout the whole thing. She's not defined in relation, other than the relationship to her husband, and a kind of very vaguely hinted at romance with another character called Justin, who we're going to come to later.
Yep.
Largely, her story is about motherhood. It's about protecting her children. Basically, she has a sick child at home named Timmy. Timmy has pneumonia. He is basically
tiny.
He is tiny, Timmy. You felt there was a whiff of Christmas Carol.
Very much a whiff of Christmas Carol. Carry on.
So tiny Timmy is at home in bed, bedridden, has a massive fever. She's trying to sort of basically find a cure because she's worried it's on death's door. And the problem is basically she's been told at the beginning of the movie that to save her son's life, she needs to keep him in bed rest, give him this medicine for about 3 or 4 days, and within about 1 or 2 days, the great move, or the move, is going to happen, which is basically when the farmer ploughs his field.
Yes.
So Mrs. Frisbee embarks on a quest to work out how she can
Brisby.
Mrs. Brisby, Mrs. Grisby, Ghibli, Jibli, Jubli.
Yeah.
Mrs. Brisby is going to embark on a quest to work out how she can both save her son and save herself from the great move and the farm. And that involves a series of characters who we'll get to as we go on.
Yes. It actually just struck me, you're right, that the position of Mrs. Brisby as a widower is really important, because it potentially is one of the first instances in this film whereby Bluth is and I don't want to continue to talk about Disney, but at least tipping the hat to Disney, because one of the things
Is it Bluth or Floof?
Oh, it's Gruth.
Gruth.
I am Gruth. Anyway, one of the ways in which the classic Disney formula has been understood by Janet Wasco and Chris Pallant, writing on Disney formalism, lots and lots of people that have written about the formulaic nature, however illusory, of that classic Disney period, is to do with families and to do with nuclear families that are sort of incomplete and single parents. And this happens a lot in Little Mermaid, Aladdin. You have the Sultan, but you never have Mrs. Sultan,
sure.
etc. This is really interesting because that's never really talked about by the characters in the film. Maybe in a sentence, or If Only Your Mother Was Here, or something like that, but never really made the focal point of a film like this. So I think you're right. There is a really interesting taking that single parent element that is often, notable by its not being talked about in Disney films, and then actually making it a really strong element of this film that allows the film to sort of do something with family that is. A lot of movies are about family in all but name, i.e. friends that become family. But this has a really interesting way of thinking about lost loves. And Mrs. Brisby talks about herself in relation to her husband. Other characters refer to her, as you say, through these actions of her amazing husband that only become clear during the end of the film. Interestingly as well, they're also talk about themselves as a woman or as a man. Mrs. Brisby, I'm a woman, and that also got me thinking about anthropomorphism and the sort of acknowledgement of their rodentness.
But I mean, and the other thing it does is obviously it's a film about motherhood and powered by motherhood.
Yes.
Where motherhood is a presence rather than an absence.
Yes.
Which is what happens in a lot of other popular animations. To stop using the D word, that's an interesting, quietly different but quietly revisionist step in the right direction. And it struck me, having watched Land Before Time recently, that actually, I'm not claiming these movies are anything to offer anything like a contemporary progressive take on gender, but I am saying in early 1980s to have Mrs. Brisby at the centre of this story, and a character like Sarah, the female Triceratops at the front of Land Before Time, who is probably the most interesting character in that movie. There is an attempt to do better by women in these stories than perhaps could be said of previous movies. I guess we have Miss Bianca in Rescuers, but she's very much defined in relation to the male Bernards, and very much sexualized. She's not, Mrs. Brisby is a determined, focused, brave when she has to be, maternal when she has to be, compassionate when she has to be, furious when she has to be character. And I think good.
well, it's not a film about her discovery of her. She already has the qualities that a lot of Disney characters end the film with having acquired.
Yeah, no, she just gets on with it.
She begins the film with having these characteristics, and also what I liked is the way in which the film stages its action sequences. So one of the first action sequences in the sort of lead up to the big move is the threat of industrialization, but it's scaled down to, nature versus culture, but it's scaled down to essentially a tractor with a combine as it twists and turns, and trying to save the home that Tiny Timmy, which I now can't not call him Tiny Timmy. Yeah, so he's in bed, and he because he needs to quarantine, and there is a sort of action sequence whereby both Mrs. Brisby and then Auntie Shrew are.
Oh yeah, I like her.
So these two female characters are essentially tasked with jumping onto the combine and unplugging all of the pistons and removing the fuel and all this sort of stuff in order to prevent the combine from running over the home. And it reminded me of the Big Ben sequence from Basil the Great Mouse Detective, and how these characters jump between the sort of whirring cogs and pulleys. But also it's a really great little action sequence that reflects on their aptitude, or it reflects on their physicality. And that chimes with a later sequence where she's ultimately captured inside a cage, and she sort of works out through trial and error how to get out. And it's really interesting that I think it's really interesting that the male character, Justin, just departs and says, I'll come back for you later. And he never comes back, but it doesn't matter because she manages to escape.
Yeah.
And so there's something, really striking about how the film acknowledges, but then doesn't over-egg her powerful status as an empowered woman, because her empowerment is not something that's exceptional to her gender. It's sort of an accepted part of it.
Well, yes. Yeah, there's no point where they could do a kind of Moana-esque.
She's unusual because she's powerful. She speaks her mind.
Yeah, they're just again, there's a lot of just getting on with it.
Yeah.
So there's a quietness to her character that I think I found quite refreshing, and I liked. So yeah, we start by sort of journeying through the fields with her, don't we? She visits a sort of what is he, a sort of scientist mouse figure, Mr. Aegis, and gets a cure for Timmy. Then she kind of journeys back through the field. She meets quote unquote lovable sidekick named Jeremy.
Whoa, let's pause on Jeremy. Right. So Jeremy looks like, well, he looks. There's when we talk about the Disney aesthetic, and we're talking about sort of hyper-realism and the again, going back to Pallant's idea, Chris Pallant's idea of Disney formalism, and a certain degree of hyper-realist qualities to Disney characters, and the idea of, you mentioned cute earlier on, actually, the sort of the cuteness of rounded characters. Now, Jeremy looks a lot like a Disney character, but also the performance of the character feels very incongruous, I think, with the film itself. He feels like a reminder of the kind of animation the film isn't doing in a strange way.
Because quite a lot of this movie is about kind of I don't know how to articulate this really, kind of shuffling and like odd conversations where someone will start a sentence and then there's a bit where like Mrs. Brisby like goes to say something, goes, oh no, I won't say it, like walks around the corner, comes back and then says it. Like there's a lot of like just nuances of like you believe these characters exist, you believe in the world, there's muffled dialogue on occasion, there's quite quiet bits of dialogue. It's all very kind of muted and somewhat austere and measured, and you know, it feels lived in and built and like mossy and all this kind of stuff. And then we get Jeremy, the wisecracking crow, who just sort of is this kind of like slapstick.
He has never seen an elephant fly, I'll tell you.
He's Aladdin, you know, the genie. He's very eccentric, very physical, lots of jumping about, lots of slapstick, lots of wisecracking. I suspect if I was under 10 and I met Jeremy, I'd think he was the best thing in the film. I did not think that because I'm not under 10.
Right. Okay, good.
Yes.
Good, mossy. So I think this taps into the world of junk. That animation is often fascinated with junk and tins, old tins and cartons and bottles to build world. I would say has been intensified more recently. There's an excellent chapter on junk art and the computer animated film in a book that's also still available in hardback and paperback.
And what's that book called?
That is called The Computer Animated Film, and then after it is a very monstrous misuse of an Oxford comma, industry style and genre. Anyway, the chapter on junk art.
Did you have to do it? Did you have to do that? Was that a publisher thing?
No, I just forgot to put it in.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, we'll cut this bit out.
Sure.
There is a chapter on junk art, but what's going back to the Secret of NIMH, the use of junk tells us about the community because it tells us about their artistry and their endeavour and their ability to build worlds out of the things that we throw away. But also it gives the world a history. So going back to your point around Don Bluth and fictional worlds, the lived-in quality, I think, comes from the fact that these objects didn't begin and end when the film began. Actually, we are seeing an old, I can't remember, fuel tin or something like that, positioned, I think, right towards the beginning of the film, maybe by Mr. Ages' home, but there's a real, or maybe it's her own, Mrs. Brisby's own home, I can't remember, but there's a real sense in that had this film is interested in the afterlife of objects, and the stuff that we throw away can be repurposed and reused in a way that is characters are able to build worlds out of them, and that sort of mossy quality, stuff that is we've thrown away because it's past its shelf life, have been reclaimed.
And the film takes its time to kind of celebrate those spaces. As I say, the first scene is basically the plot is Mrs. Brisby needs some medicine for her son. She gets some medicine. The story starts. But it takes about 4 or 5 minutes. They go down various rooms, various chambers. Yeah. We're introduced to a space, a feeling, a place. That kind of hyperactiveness of Jeremy is at odds with a movie that isn't very hyperactive. It's got a lot of things to say and places to go and people to see, but it does it in a kind of much more,
visual. He does it in a visual way, whereas Jeremy is the verbal, quick-fire equivalent of information. He is Basil Exposition from the Austin Powers films. Tell me about the things.
Well, except that he doesn't do anything to do with the plot ever. He just kind of flies in. Mrs. Brisby gets a bit irritated, tells him to go away and do something to distract him.
Yeah, so even she's annoyed.
And you're like, why are we dealing with this guy then? If even the main character's annoyed by them, why are you here? But so there's this crow. He's called Jeremy. He kind of vaguely helps her along the way, but actually, as you say, seems more of a kind of gesture to traditional animated convention than it does.
Just a nice little sideline. I just found it was a nice, whether it's as self-conscious as we want to.
Yeah, okay.
This is a deliberate acknowledgement of the world that Bluth has left behind. It would be great if it was, but it just felt like an interesting sidelining of a different kind of animated character.
So Mrs. Brisby goes back home. We are introduced to her children, her domestic space. Yes, her friend, the kind of, what's her name, Aunt Shrew, is it?
Auntie Shrew,
who is kind of a brisk matriarch figure who is both an ally but also kind of, speaks truth.
She does not suffer fools gladly.
No, that's right. Yes, absolutely not. Yeah. So, and then the kind of real high fantasy quest begins because they decide how are they going to look after Timmy and also not and escape the big plough. They will, of course, the only thing they can do, go see the great owl.
So But before
Oh, right, yes,
no,
okay.
but before all of that, we have a little prologue. We have a little beginning of the film.
Yes.
If this is not the Disney storybook. This is a book being written.
Yes.
A magical book being written. Very Lord of the Rings-esque, I put, at a sort of unseen or truncatedly seen wizard.
Yes.
We don't. So that we only see his kind of gnarly hands, and it's difficult, I think, at moments to figure out whether this is human or animal.
Yes.
And I was trying to figure out what that sequence does in relation to what follows. Does it set up a film? Does it write a check that the film doesn't then cash, or deliberately makes the check bounce?
So I am interested in that. Yeah, so we're introduced to this unknown kind of
Before everything,
soothsayery, wizardy thing. You don't really see his face. He's looking through a magical globe. He keeps commenting on what Mrs. Brisby's doing.
Yep.
He's writing spells, incarnations. He's gnarly. He's twisted. His features are kind of angular. And,
Yep.
And I wonder, because I've obviously seen the movie before, and it's been a while, so I remembered who that character was. Did you think that might be the villain of the piece when you first saw it?
Absolutely, and it chimed with a Bakshi-esque. Oh, this is what the film's doing. Late 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
With the wizards and as you know, like the way of. What year was Bakshi's Lord of the Rings?
That was 78.
Right. Okay, so we've had wizards and we've had Lord of the Rings. This felt very much cut from the same imaginative, fantastical cloth.
Yeah.
And then the film didn't follow that up, and it was only when the character reappeared later. We've had our great owl, our Gandalf character.
Yeah, so he's a big old soothsayer owl thing. He tells Mrs. Brisby to go see the rats of NIMH, and crucially go see their leader Nicodemus. Nicodemus, thank you very much, Nicodemus.
Yeah.
So Nicodemus, the leader of the rats of NIMH. Plot is set up. Who are these rats? What's NIMH? What is the secret? Oh my God, Mrs. Brisby's going to go and find out. And it's revealed as she goes to find out and encounters these rats of NIMH that Nicodemus is this figure we've been seeing, this kind of gnarled wizard, somewhat Gandalf-like, but also kind of Rasputin in a later Bluth movie, Anastasia-like in his composure. And I think that's deliberate. I think it's very significant in this movie and in the book that the most civilized creatures in this entire story are rats.
Yeah.
And that rats are actually on a kind of more higher noble plane than voles and mice and all this kind of stuff. It's the rats that are the source of good, also the source of tension and evil, but the source of good within the story. And this Nicodemus, who we think by design is going to be this gnarly evil character because he looks a bit like that, is actually a very benevolent, avuncular, Gandalf-esque figure, and I can't help feel that's deliberate. We'll get to the Secret of NIMH in a minute, but one of the things that we are revealed about the rats very early on is that we think they're going to be these dangerous, evil rats, but actually the film flips that around, and the rats are a source of hospitality, of civilization, of grandeur, and that's narrativized in the story that comes.
No, and their relationship to sort of energy and building a self-sufficient community, which we'll talk about in relation to anthropomorphism and how they come to acquire intelligence. Nicodemus, yes, he's an unseen wizard, but there's some interesting. At one point, or I think it's his second appearance, you have the prologue, which sort of sets up the role of magic in a film. Then everything after that is pretty matter of fact. Up until the threat isn't magic and demons, it's pistons and pumps on a combine. He then reappears. Seems to be watching over events in the film.
Yes.
Are these past events? Are they happening live? Are they future events? I thought that was a really striking way of is he predicting future events or is he reflecting? And he sort of assumes the role of narrator again. And I just thought that was a really striking way. He looks into his magic mirror and sees through a portal characters and comments on the characters. And that's where the benevolence starts to appear.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And he's a wizard, and why he's a wizard and how he's a wizard is never really explained. And that's kind of part of the joy of a character who's a wizard is, you don't need Gandalf to be explained necessarily. I'm sure a Tolkien fan will now contact me and explain exactly how, because it's in paragraph 87 of the appendices, but, I don't need it, thanks. These are characters that live outside of rules, that embody a certain potentiality, a certain... and as much as the civilization of these rats, so... Brisby journeys to visit them. They live in a rose bush in the garden, but actually once she gets inside the rose bush, she discovers, as you say, electricity, working lights, contraptions, lifts, great palaces, a great civilization,
a debating hall,
living under this grand. All the rats are dressed in robes, and there's a military of rats. There's a council of rats, and so we are struck by talking about world building. We've gone from a world where people are living in baked bean cans, and there's an owl living in a nest in the woods, and Jeremy's hanging out in the field being a crow. And what's the cat? There's a kind of adversarial cat who's the farmer's cat called Dragon, is it?
Yes, Dragon. It's written on the bowl, yeah.
Who's very much just, a sort of classic anthropomorphic fat killer
not,
demon cat.
Yeah, definitely not ominous. We just should have called the cat demon.
Yeah. So we've gone from this world of vague anthropomorphic. You're going to have to talk me through this, but anthropomorphic in a kind of lower register. These are very much micey mice and owly owls, and they talk and they communicate and they potentially wear a cloak every now and again, but they are largely defined by mouseness to rats that are actually much more like humans than they are rats. We go to Rat City, essentially.
Yeah. I know I've talked about this on previous episodes, but anthropomorphism is often used as a synonym to describe a whole number of ways that animals or animalistic qualities and human-like qualities come to intersect. And Paul Wells, in his book, The Animated Bestiary, talks a lot about what he calls the Madagascar problem, which is, and again, I know I've mentioned this before, the way in which animals in films are presented as a series of contradictions between their natural animalistic impulses and then their ability to sort of talk like Chris Rock.
Sure.
And their human-like qualities and the things that they feel versus the things that they feel as animals. So he terms it the Madagascar problem and this sort of bestial ambivalence, he terms it, that comes with the territory with regards to anthropomorphic characters that are in flux. And so I've been interested in perhaps nuancing that term and thinking about other ways in which human-like and non-human-like characters or characteristics collide. And so writing on therianthropy talks about different kinds of... So a therianthrope, a good example of a therianthrope would be in Beauty and the Beast, Cogsworth and Lumiere.
Right.
They are anthropomorphic characters, but actually they are human-like characters that have been transformed into objects. So they are therianthropes because they began life as human. And actually... Therianthropy more accurately describes what we term anthropomorphism in Disney, because there's no real engagement, as you say, with mouseness. It doesn't matter.
Well, it depends which one we're talking about, right? But Mickey Mouse, certainly.
Yes, so Mickey Mouse can drive a steamboat, no problem.
Sure.
And there isn't the sort of... Yeah, there's more of an engagement with his symbolism as a human for us to engage with. Whereas certainly there are more...
Yeah.
There are differences in anthropomorphic characters, more so perhaps of degree rather than kind, where there is more of an engagement with ratness, so Ratatouille or B-movie.
We could call it the kind of Goofy to Pluto scale.
Yes.
They're both dogs, but
yes.
Goofy is not really a dog.
Yes, one wears a waistcoat and one doesn't.
Yeah.
So that is... I would say Goofy is a therianthrope because he might as well be a human that has been turned into a dog or
and that's
a human.
quite useful because then you're thinking, okay, what kind of human is Goofy, and then we can start to pick apart what it's playing.
He might as well be Cogsworth, or he might as well be Lumiere. Was a human, click of the fingers and turned into an animal. Whereas yes, Pluto is more of an anthropomorph because there's at least more of a leaning towards his animalistic behaviour.
Yes.
Some animals can play basketball in Space Jam, and some are just animals.
Yeah. So Secret of
summarise,
NIMH, Secret of NIMH is really kind of playing with that scale then, because we have Dragon, the cat, who is a cat.
Yes, it has to be a cat because his threat to the mice comes from the fact he's a cat.
Yeah. So there's the cat doesn't speak; it's a cat.
Yeah.
To Jeremy and Mrs. Brisby, who are They can talk. They communicate to one another. She can read a little bit. Her husband taught her, as she mentions.
Yep.
Again, reading is a significant
Plot twist.
marker of this scale in this story.
Yep.
And Auntie Shrew and all these characters
Might as well be. Yeah, might as well be.
Well, there's. I would say they are more. You think they may as well be humans, but then when we're introduced to the rats of NIMH, there is a desire to ask you to see them as more. What's the word you used?
More
therianthropic than Mrs. Frisbee. Mrs. Frisbee is...
This is a fun game.
I know. Mrs. Frisbee is more mouse
Yes.
than the rats of NIMH are rat-like.
Yes.
And that becomes part of the plot. Why are the rats less rat-like than the mice are mice-like and the voles are vole-like and the Jeremy is crow-like and all this kind of stuff?
Yes. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The film is really interested in gradations of anthropomorphic behaviour to the point where it leans towards kind of more therianthropic understandings of human transformation into object or creature. As I said, the Lumieres of this world. I would also cast Basil the Great Mouse Detective. He lives in a world of his scale, he has a pipe of his size. So some characters in The Secret of NIMH do come across like that. Their world is to their scale. They built them. They might as well be human. But you're absolutely right. When this world is fleshed out, you really get a sense of the scale of different ways or different kinds of bestial ambivalence, to go back to Wells's term.
And that's what makes this a much more complex story than
Yes.
like there are other examples of this kind of anthropomorphic high fantasy, which is much more what you're talking about. They may as well be human. I mean, there's as I say, the Red Wall series was a massively successful children's things, and that's the rats are all the villains are rats and wildcats and evil animals, quote unquote.
Yep.
All the good guys are mice and voles, and they live in abbeys and homes, and they have feasts, and they may as well be humans. All that.
Yes.
What's that Zack Snyder thing? The
Owls of Ga'Hoole.
The Owls of Ga'Hoole. Yeah,
Yes.
Again, they may be owls in the title, but they may as well not be owls.
Yes.
There's very little owlness going on in here. But it is essential to this story that you think about that scale of anthropomorphism in this film, because it's part of the narrative. It's part of the tension and the relationship between characters.
Yeah. Well, the reason you're asked to think about it, as you say, is because it becomes folded into what the narrative is about. So if I've got this correct. Now, you said that you asked me before we started if I knew what NIMH stood for.
Yes.
It was mentioned very briefly in the film, because that really unpacks. That was an interesting moment, because it unpacks the believability of a fictional world is often rooted in characters that can't possibly know everything. So that's why they discover, or they don't realise that rats are being part of a experiment, or being captured and being part of a scientific experiment. So NIMH stands for...
So I think you might have to check on because you've got access to Google. I think it stands for National Institute of Mental Health. And it's said once in the movie, and it's a throwaway line. It's made a much more bigger deal of in the book.
Yep.
But in the film, you blink and you'll miss it. It's about halfway through.
Yep.
You hear the farmer's wife say, "Has the National Institute of Mental Health been on the phone?" or something to that effect.
Yeah.
It's a throwaway little line, and it's there to tease you can you put two and two together about what NIMH is. The rats never say that. They only refer to it as NIMH, but they do explain their origin story eventually, or at least Nicodemus does. And he explains that the plot twist, the secret of NIMH, spoiler alert, is that these rats were experimented on in a laboratory. They'd been injected with all kinds of things and essentially been given a partial form of human consciousness.
Yes.
They've been given an ability to, it's never quite explained exactly what's happened, but it's a sort of Flowers for Algernon-esque kind of narrative of...
It's Cogsworth again. It's Cogsworth and Lumiere, the magic of Beauty and the Beast.
They've injected humans...
Yeah.
Yes, all right, fair enough. Yeah, human spirit into animal.
Yeah, so they might as well... So the reason that they're so refined and cultured is that the film narratively... and similarly to Beauty and the Beast, does what the Beast, and that obviously the whole film about Beauty and the Beast is about his internal tension. But the fact is that he began life as a human, and one of the issues with Beauty and the Beast is if he began life as a human and transformed into an animal, why has he forgotten? Has he lived as a beast for so long he's forgotten what cutlery is? Because he had a good 20 years of knowing what cutlery was. But anyway.
Yeah.
So this film does a similar kind of thing. It, as you say, quite literally injects humanity into these characters, turns them into not just a rat that we go, oh, look at the little fella, in a sort of vague understanding of anthropomorphism, but it almost turns them into what fantasy and literature would understand as therianthrope, the mythology of the therianthrope, i.e. a human that was transformed, or a half human, half... It's that hybridity that the film brings out by having a sort of scientific sequence.
So when the novel came out, it was relatively well received. In fact, it was very well received. But a criticism that was levied at it, which I'd be interested to see what you thought about in terms of the movie, was the same criticism got levied at that B-movie thing, which is that, like, so hang on a minute. That there's no, basically that revelation of the Secret of NIMH destroys the logic of the story, because this is the argument, is that if the reason the rats can speak and the reason the rats can write and the reason the rats are civilized is because they were injected with a serum, what's Mrs. Brisby doing?
Yes.
Because Mrs. Brisby can also speak and move about and stand on her hind legs and wear a cloak and live in a house and all this kind of stuff. But she isn't injected with this same serum. So if you're going to rationalise that part of the anthropomorphic register, you've kind of broken the spell of animals can talk that's sort of implied throughout the rest of it.
So, yes.
I mean, not necessarily my criticism, but a criticism that was levied at it.
Well, one, I would say speech is often a shorthand. That's the difference between, say, Goofy and Pluto. You know, that speech is often a shorthand for understanding this kind of register. But for me, it's the difference between Mrs. Brisby and... well, I suppose Mrs. Brisby and Jenna, the villain.
The villain of there's a villainous rat who wants. What does he want? He wants. We'll come to that in a second. There's Jenna. Who's
I'm not entirely sure I know what he wants, but
are we having a no time to die?
We are having a what's his plan? Anyway, so the difference between Mrs. Brisby and say Jenna. So Jenna being one of the rats who has been injected, presumably, which is why he's.
Well, I think all the rats have been injected.
Or it certainly began with a handful, but presumably that's accelerated.
I guess so, yes. Yeah, there seems to be more than there were, right? Yeah.
So the difference between Mrs. Brisby and Jenna is their ability to be able to at least embrace part of their rodent identity. So there is a difference between Mrs. Brisby exploiting her ratness to get into the combine, to go up and through and around, and the failure of Jenna to be able to behave like a rat. And in fact, the climax is a sword fight, which might as well be between two humans, the good and the bad, between Justin and Jenna. So I think that part of the clarification of that different register is to do with Mrs. Brisby still has the aptitude to behave like a rodent, whereas that avenue has been shut off because of the experimentation. These rats can no longer live typically as rats, and that element of their identity. And in fact, when we first meet the rats, that's why that kind of debating room, the council, is really important. They are all standing in robes. They are not doing ratty things, and they never really do ratty things. Whereas Mrs. Brisby, her ability to escape from that cage is because she leans on her ratness and being able to contort her body now up and out through the cage.
Yeah, so her moistness.
Her moistness, sorry, her rodentness, if you will. But there is I think it's the whether or not the ability to perform as a rodent, to perform as a non-human, is something that the film allows these characters to do, and when it allows them to do it.
I also think it then makes the story more self-conscious about what its themes are, because it then becomes about, you know, if the story were there are animals like dragon, and there are animals, and then there are these rats that got injected with this serum, and they are anthropomorphic, and they can speak and they can talk, and that's the only schism. Then what that is exactly what you're saying. It's a story about humanity. It's a story about it's not about a clash between animal and human identity. By having it as this more kind of liminal sliding scale, it becomes a much more kind of, you know, you're asked to think about where the divide should go. I mean, there's lines that are almost tragic about the fact they've lost in touch with their ratness, isn't there? Because there's this whole thing that they're using electricity because they're stealing it from the farmer, and they're like, we can't do this anymore because we know too much. We know that stealing is bad. We know that we can't live like rats anymore, so we're going to have to move. It's going to be really dangerous. We're going to have to kind of journey into another world, another place. They do refer to the place they're going to, but I don't quite remember what it's called.
Thorn Valley?
And you never see it. They just kind of go there at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
But they're going to travel to this new place, not necessarily because they want to, but because they have to, because they know that they can't live like this anymore. Their conscience won't allow them anymore. And but Jenna, you just said that Jenna couldn't be rat enough. But of course, Jenna's plan, he doesn't want, like, he says, let's stay where we are. There's nothing wrong with where we are. We don't need to move. We can be more ratty, if you will. So it becomes about that kind of interplay rather than it being sort of so simple as that.
No, as you were talking, I was thinking about that when Mrs. Brisby is captured, and I was thinking about the moment where she's underneath the floorboards. She takes off her markers of humanity. She takes off her cape, and she's encouraged to take off her cape because it might catch. And she takes off this sort of amulet and hangs it up. And then she becomes a rat for 5 minutes and gets captured. And the child puts a sort of cup over her or a colander or something and says, "I've caught a rat. We need to get rid of it." And then she's put in a cage. And then when she manages to escape, she resumes her humanity, pops the cape back on, pops the amulet on, and then goes about her business. And that is a really interesting sequence. When she's a rat, when she's a mouse, when she's a rodent, when she embraces her rodentness, she's captured and she's treated as such. She's treated as a rodent by the child character. I just thought it was a really interesting momentary lapse in her humanity that then creates, she's captured from it. But anyway, I mean, I don't have much else to say other than the scope of voice work from British to US voices is sort of what that means in relation to the performances, because some characters
the rats. Oh no, all the rats are British except Justin, who's like, as I say, this kind of handsome, hunky rat that Mrs. Brisby kind of flutters her eyes at. She flutters her eyes twice in this movie. Once, kind of when she first sees this Justin, but that's not really enacted on after that. No, because Justin leaves at the end of the movie, and there's no sense of a romance.
She doesn't need a romance to complete herself.
Well, she's good, but there is a. She's clearly attracted to him. I thought the film was going to do that. Yes, she's clearly attracted to him when she first sees him, and then she also does it in a very kind of interesting way to kind of tell Jeremy to buzz off. She kind of plays a waif-like character to make him think he has to save her by flying over to the other side of the farm.
I need a strong man.
Yeah. So, there are two moments she kind of performs that kind of exaggerated Disney femininity, if you will.
Which I suppose is a sign of consciousness. It's part of her ability to perform is an ability to be aware of registers. So
Jeremy is American. He's voiced by Dom
DeLuise.
Dom DeLuise, who is a sort of stalwart of the Bloom sort of world. It comes up again and again and again. Sometimes, if I remember rightly, more successfully in other movies, but we'll see if and when we come to them. But everyone, I think the
wise characters. So I was.
You're right. The Owl's American, isn't he?
So John Carradine. Yeah, but I was thinking of Derek Jacobi as Nicodemus.
Yes. Derek Jacobi as Claudius, as Nicodemus.
Although Elizabeth Hartman, Mrs. Brisby, is American. I can't remember if she plays.
And the kids are American, and Auntie Vole is American.
And the film features an early performance from Will Wheaton. As Martin Brisby, one of the children. Okay. But a lot of you don't really know much about the farmers, so the Mr. and Mrs. Farmer Fitzgibbons, I should say, and the son Billy. But it struck me. I don't have much to say about. Is
it just trading on that classic, British quote unquote old world, more civilized kind of thing? How do we make the rats sound civilized? We give them British accents, kind of thing.
Possibly, yeah. I just thought it was an interesting.
Yeah, that is true.
Scope.
I guess the only other thing to say is just back to that thing about sliding scales and the tension between magic and who wields magic, who wields industry, all that sort of stuff. Is obviously the end of the story of Jonathan Brisby, Mrs. Jonathan Brisby, Mr. Jonathan Brisby, is that Jonathan was also a mouse of NIMH. He was also injected with this serum.
Yeah.
And there are hints that obviously Mrs. Brisby is taught her skills partially from Jonathan.
Yeah.
So he bestows his intelligence onto her, we could get back into gender issues on that. But I more meant on a plot point. So there is a sense
non-scientifically
that
as well.
it's not just about it's not just about genetics here. There aren't just chosen rats and non-chosen people. There is not just civilization and non-civilization. Yeah. You can civilize, quote unquote, civilize the non-civilized, and those that are quote unquote non-civilized can attain civilized status through work and effort and practice and labor. Yeah. So there is a complication to that just by that character's arc as well.
Yeah. It's not just magic. And I suppose my sort of mild criticism of the film is the use of at the end when the Brisby home is it's raining and the Brisby home is sort of sinking into the mud.
Yeah.
That because the rats are unable, which is surprising because the rats are more human-like in their behaviour. They can't raise it using pulleys and their own industry. The film leans on the magic to solve the thing, and that was the only sort of, and I was thinking about the relationship between magic and industry in that sense.
I think we need a little bit more rules explained about what that ruby's supposed to do, because it's not really explained. It's sort of added last minute, it would seem. I think I get the thematic point it's trying to make, which is, ultimately all the powers of industry don't triumph over magic, which is quite a high fantasy point.
But I also feel like the film has tried to not set that up at various moments, or at least shown the worth of industry.
Yes, exactly. You're right. You're right. Yeah, it feels like a kind of very quick full stop to a rather complicated set of contradictions and parallels.
My second issue with the film is essentially marrying off Jeremy at the end.
Oh yeah, so Jeremy's story is that Jeremy wants a wife, and Mrs. Brisby is going to teach him how to get a wife, because he can't get one because he's so clumsy.
Right. I didn't need that I didn't feel like that his narrative was a thread that needed snipping and tied up in a nice bow.
Obviously what happens at the end is this equally clumsy female crow comes flying in, and they all live happily ever after.
Exactly.
So to speak.
So I think that's all I've got. I think we're almost at time.
I think that's time. I think that's the Secret of NIMH unpacked. I think. Yeah. I mean, it's a brisk little movie. It's only an hour and 20 minutes long. And as I say, there's a lot of characters. There's a lot of locations. There's a lot of world building going on. And I think, I think Bloof is a figure we must revisit again later in the pod. We know we've got plenty more episodes to record, and I'm sure we will revisit him.
Love a blog, love a blog on a.
Oh Bloof. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone who's writing about Bloof out there, they should get in touch. fantasy-animation.org. There's a contact us tab. We'd love to hear something about Bloof. I think he's not that written about.
No.
That's mentioned in animation history, but there's no dedicated work to him, or very little.
Lots of potential future episodes.
Absolutely. So I guess Chris, it's been delighted.
I know.
It's been delightful to be back in the room with you. It's better this way.
Yeah, we can go and have lunch now, can't we?
Have lunch. We watched the movie here this morning. Oh, it's like old times again.
Yes.
And it was nice to revisit the movie with you and for you to see it for the first time. I guess I better do the admin, hadn't I? So you can, of course, contact us at fantasy-animation.org, as well as by email. Always remember to plug the email, fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Let us know your feedback on this episode. Did we leave anything out? Did we get anything wrong? Almost certainly. So let us know about it and bruise our egos, or at least Chris's, because he'll probably read it before I do. But of course, you can also have that conversation with us on social media. We're on Twitter, and we're on Facebook, and we're on Instagram, and the handle is exactly the same, FANANIM Research, FANANIM Research. Any researchers out there who want to write about Bloof, get in contact. We'd be delighted to hear from you. Otherwise, leave us a review. What else can we ask you to do?
Go back and listen to some episodes.
Go back and listen to some episodes on
star rating. Stuff like that.
Give us a star rating. Buy our books.
Both were mentioned in a terrible act of shoehorning. But we've recorded it,
and that's enough plugging. So we'll see you on the next episode.
Bye.